I'm joined with Tim Ballard. He's a historian, author of The Covenant. Welcome. How are you, sir?
I'm great. It's great to be here.
You put this book together, and this is not the book you expected to write.
That's correct.
Okay. You were writing a book on
foreign policy. I work for the United States government, and a lot of work overseas and helping children who are being exploited. And I was fascinated by the power for good that America was in this instance. And I wanted to kind of find the roots of that greatness. And I thought I should start with a chapter or two on the founding, because there's something there probably. Well, I never got to the foreign policy part. Those two chapters turned into a whole book. And that goodness is the title of the book. That goodness, the power, is the covenant.
You know, de Tocqueville said that we are, he's credited as saying, he found America's goodness in her churches. We are great because we are good. This is much further than just be good.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
Take me from Columbus and tell me the story of what the covenant is.
The covenant is, I will be your God, you will be my people. We read about this in the Old Testament. Well, what if the Old Testament story is replayed on American soil? And my contention is that it was. And we can go back to Columbus himself. What a fascinating person in our history that is completely underrated and cast aside. Columbus understood a lot of things about what he was doing. And he said, if you read in his journal, the Book of the Prophecies, he called it, he said, I am discovering a new world. He thought it was the Indies, but it was a new world. And it's going to begin a chain of events that will restore Israel.
This is so amazing, as we talked about on my radio program today, because maybe 2 years ago, I went to a few scholars, including Dr. Peter Lilback, and I said, I'm telling you, we made a covenant, and our founders knew it, and it was all leading up to the founding of Israel. And the question will be whether we are now, if we've outlived our usefulness because we're no longer living the covenant. And Peter said to me, Glenn, he's a formal scholar on George Washington and his religious writings, and he said, I don't think you can make that case. And I said, Peter, would you just look? He was on the show a couple of months ago, and he wrote a little book about that big just on what George Washington said about Israel. He called me up and he said, Glenn, believe it or not, I think you're right. I think you're right. And it only makes common sense. We talked about this earlier today. America's Prophet, this is Bruce Feiler.
Excellent book.
Great book. It's about how America, all the way from the Pilgrims and Columbus, they knew they were coming over. I haven't read this.
You got to read it.
I got to read it.
Yes.
Okay. And then McCullough.
Awesome. McCullough
also talks about something that you talk about in your book, which is, he talks about the fog, but you talk specifically about the covenant of that fog.
Right.
Explain what George Washington did.
On May 17th, 1776. Today, which, awesome that I get to be here explaining it today. George Washington called his men to fast and pray. And he told them that we will only be victorious if God blesses our arms. And he actually issued that in conjunction with the Continental Congress. And he did it again in July. In fact, he did it before all the major miracles and battles that we can read about. And so he knew the British were coming. And he knew when they came, I mean, he's leading a band of citizen soldiers, farmers. And what's he thinking? How on earth is he going to take on the superpower of the world? Because he knows something, the secret. There's a covenant, and he can tap into it, and he's trying desperately to do it. He issues these calls. Now, the Battle of Long Island begins, and we know the story. The British.
Most people don't.
You're probably right. And so what happens? The Americans get routed. They get spanked pretty hard. Washington and his men go running back to the East River. They've got to get over this mile-wide East River back into New York, back to safety, and get out of town. The problem is the British are sending up their powerful navy to sandwich them in at Brooklyn Heights.
Right.
So what does Washington do? He says, we're going to cross anyway. His commanders say, you're nuts. How are you going to do this? Again, Washington knew. Nighttime falls. they make the crossing. The British land troops don't know he's on the move because they keep the campfires going, make it seem like they're bedding down for the night. An enormous windstorm, and McCullough talks about this, rushes down this East River and keeps the Navy back. The British can't make their way up. And he makes his crossing. Now, night is going to break. Okay, the sun's coming up. The scheme will be exposed. What happens? Right as the sun comes up, a pea soup fog drops down. They called it a pea soup fog, a providential fog. Yeah. It was God. They knew it. They said it was.
All of them.
All of them.
Even the British.
And yeah, they did. They had to. What else could they say? The fog wasn't anywhere else. It was just right there. 20 minutes after the last man crosses that river, and that last man is Washington, that says something, the fog dissipates. In enough time for the British to look over the river and just put their hands in the air and say, what on earth?
Where did they go? How did that happen?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a miracle.
Okay, so you contend, and I do as well, that when we got down on our knees and prayed and fasted and begged God, forgive us, please help us, we will do your will, we're not asking you to be on our side, we'll be on your side, will you just be our God, we'll be your people. That just as he did with ancient Israel, he made a covenant, and he honored that. We have slipped out of that covenant several times. I think we started slipping out of that covenant after all the founders died around 1830. It got ugly, manifest destiny. But then we slipped back into it, and you know the scene. It's when Lincoln is on the battlefield, and he keeps losing and losing and losing. His son dies, right?
Absolutely.
And he's like, what do you want from me?
Yes.
And he makes a covenant on a battlefield.
That's exactly right.
And he makes this covenant, and it happens again, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. When we come back, I want to talk to you about the presidents that were that have made the covenant, because I'd like to know, how did we make it through World War II? Because I don't think FDR was making this covenant. And then also what the covenant is, because there's specific things at the end of the book that you say, these are the things we have to do. You want this blessing, you have to do these things.